If you want to know the best medium tanks within World of Tanks console, well, you've come to the right video, or at least the video series where we look at the top 5 medium tanks from every single kind of tier throughout the entire tech tree line, as well as the premium vehicles that are also within here as well. So we'll look at tier 5 and upwards. We're not going to look at tier 3s and 4s because they are just typically ones that people skip through anyway, so there's not much point. But the key thing is that we're going to look through this video in particular in part 1 at tiers 5 to tiers 6. So we'll look at the lower tier medium tanks that I highly recommend you have, whether you're an experienced player looking to have a bit of a challenge to 3-mark something, or if you're just trying to find an easy little grind to begin with, then we'll have a look at those now. So without further ado, let's jump into the tier 5 and 6 filter that I've got with mediums, and of course go through some of the ones that I think are really good. We'll start off with tier 5 and pick up the ones that are just super strong. And there would be no stronger tier for tier tank, in my opinion, in World of Tanks console than the Panzer V4. Now this is a tier 5 medium tank. Kind of. Well, it is technically a medium tank, but this tank, for some reason, Wargaming's absolute brilliantness, decided that they'd give a medium tank a tier 7 medium tank armor, which at tier 5 is like better than most heavy tanks, and it also gave it the speed of pretty much a light tank, so you can go 66 kilometers an hour in the setup that we've got. It also has very good damage per minute as well for a tier 5 medium tank, and it also has very, very solid ramming potential, because essentially the Panzer V4 is a Panther hull. So you see the bottom half, which is a tier 7 medium in World of Tanks, and it is of course a premium, so it is completely pay to win. You can see the armor model here. You've got about 85 millimeters of armor on the upper plate, which when angled is probably more like 150, so most tanks at this tier will probably bounce off of the upper plate. Tanks above you may go through you, but not guaranteed, and of course as soon as you start angling even more, then it becomes super hard to reliably pen tier 5 against this vehicle. So not only does it have amazing armor, it has 66 kilometers an hour top speed as a medium tank, remember. It has more hit points than pretty much every single tier 5 heavy tank in the game, because why wouldn't you give a tier 5 medium tank more health than a heavy tank? Because if, for example, we take a pretty chunky and probably one of the best heavy tanks at tier 5, the T1 Heavy, it only has 660 hit points. Compare that to the most wonderfully balanced Panzer V4, it has an extra 200. So yeah, this vehicle is absolutely outrageously, disgustingly broken, and basically at tier 5, the more Panzer V4s you have on your team, the increased chance of you winning the game is, and it is the only tank that I've been able to consecutively win over 40 games in a row in, because why the hell not? It's just, I played it in a 3-man platoon. It's outrageous, everyone knows about it, and I'm sure if you've played at tier 5, this tank has basically been the annoying, absolute toxic vehicle to pretty much all of the new players in the game, and it should 100% be removed. Even though it is quite a lot of fun to play, it's completely broken and must be one of the biggest deterrents from most people deciding to actually play World of Tanks in the first place, since seal clubbers with like 50,000 games in the Panzer V4 thinking that they're amazing at the game, playing an overpowered tank that is literally better than every single way, for some reason think that they're good. But yeah, the Panzer V4 is just not balanced whatsoever, and of course is the best tier 5 in the game, whether it's a heavy, medium, tank destroyer, artillery, whatever it is the best tier 5, and hence why it's on the top 5 for tier 5 mediums. Now, moving swiftly on from the most broken one, let's have a look at another vehicle, because there's a ton of tier 5s that could potentially make the list, but I think even though it might be slightly controversial, the M4 is a tank that I absolutely loved, because it had the kind of main armament where you can choose between whatever you want. You can choose a howitzer, essentially, a big derpy gun that can deal 410 damage, as you can see on screen right now. Granted that this is significantly worse than if you were to use the 75mm gun or the 76mm gun. Either of the guns are fantastic within their own right, but yeah, it just has so much versatility with regards to the armament that you're using and which you prefer. It has basically no armor, to be honest with you, so you're not going to be able to bounce a whole deal, but it is certainly quite a nice one to play. It's iconic. Is it the most overpowered tank in the game? Probably not, but it is certainly a very, very fun one to use. It's fairly fast, it's got a brilliant gun, and that is really what carries this tank into my top 5 list. And yeah, I just really, really did enjoy playing the vehicle, so there isn't much else that I can say about it other than that. Now, the other vehicle that I really enjoyed is pretty much the kind of opposite, so it's the Soviet version of the M4, which is the T-34, and this one is much the same. It has this brilliant 76mm that you can use. It has pretty decent penetration for a tier 5 vehicle, and with premium ammunition it's even better. And of course, when you have a decent amount of damage that you can deal per shot, as well as having essentially an okay amount of armor for a tier 5, but remember, like, as soon as you start coming up against higher tier vehicles, they'll just pen you every single day of the week, along with most tier 5s will pen you either way. But you start to learn the playstyle of the Soviet mediums, which I find always really, really fun to use, and it kind of gets you into the mood of playing the T-34, the T-34-85M, which is a tier 6, and we'll get into that later on within this video. But yeah, the T-34 is a really, really fun one that I really enjoyed playing. The next medium that I actually really enjoyed playing is the STRV M42, and this is the tier 5 Swedish medium that kind of gets involved, much like the tier 5 and 6 vehicles of the kind of the Soviet line. They pretty much set you up for the following vehicles, and this is a really, really decent but very underrated vehicle because it has a brilliant main armament, and the upgrades allow you to get this 7.5cm main armament that does 110 damage, but it has really, really good penetration. The tank is fairly mobile. It's got really good gun depression, which allows it to basically use ridgelines, gets you into learning the ridgeline mentality of a lot of the Swedish tanks, and it also essentially has very good vision range mainly, and overall just a brilliant medium tank that I think a lot of people kind of skip over, or maybe don't really understand how to play it initially, but going back to it is certainly something that I'd recommend most people to do, because I just found it to be really, really fun, and of course maybe not as good tier for tier as the tier 6, but we'll get into that later on. Much like the T-34, yeah, it's a very, very good tank. The next time we actually drop back to the American line in the form of a vehicle that maybe most people hate, and that is the Ram 2. But that's because this tank has an insane fire rate, but it does require you to fire a lot of premium. So it is a premium tank in itself, but you pretty much have to spend the premium credits that you earn as a bonus on literally paying for premium ammunition in the vehicle to be able to make it work effectively. And that's because the Ram 2 is a super fast firing tank that only does 75 damage per shell, and the premium rounds are very, very expensive for what they are, and considering how much damage you do, 2,500 pretty much, so super expensive. But nonetheless, if you do fire it with this premium rounds, it makes it so annoying to come up against, because it's constantly bombarding your tanks with rounds that are penning every single time. It also has kind of okay armor. For example, it has this really quite weird turret, which is actually pretty strong for a tier 5. You can see here, 76mm on the front of the turret and the upper hull. You do have some weak points in the form of that cupola on the front of the tank, which can be penned, but overall the armor model actually holds up quite well, and with a decent amount of over-angling when people are aiming at you, you can make the tank work pretty well. And granted, there aren't a huge ton of like broken tier 5 mediums other than the Panzer 5.4 and the couple of first ones that I've mentioned earlier on. There are variants of the M4, like the Champion M4, which is a preferential M4 that you could have got from basically taking part in like the Tank or Super Bowl a long time ago, in 2018 in fact, so what, 5 years ago now, so crazy. But yeah, it was a really, really good event, and of course gave you the preferential Champion M4, and I don't think it's actually ever been released for a sale, so yeah, it was a novel and unique tank back then, and of course still is now. But other than that, like there's very few medium tanks that I feel like are in the same league, and it kind of comes down to what do you enjoy playing. And so I think the next couple, we're going to talk about what I enjoy playing out of the last, because they're all very, very similar. They all typically are not that overpowered tier for tier, because mediums don't typically get that good until you reach about tier 6, and tier 7s are kind of where it's at, and then tier 9 and above are where mediums become good again. So tier 8 mediums are kind of a little bit lackluster tier for tier, but nonetheless. The next vehicle is the Panzer IV Hydro, and that's because it's a tech tree vehicle. I could showcase loads of premium vehicles. There are 20 premium tier for tier 5 medium tanks, but the Panzer IV-H is a tank that actually gets a pretty solid main armament, and although it may be questionably like a bit OP with the 10.5 centimeter that does it's kind of a derp gun, much like the previous, like we've talked about. But either way, with a good equipment and loadout setup, you can reduce the accuracy, like the bloom, and so therefore increase your accuracy with the 10.5 and make it work a little bit more. But much like the Ram 2, you're going to have to fire a lot of premium to make it work 100%. But if you don't want to fire a premium, you can always use the 7.5 centimeter, which is slightly better than the original, and of course it makes this tank work quite well. There is of course a turret upgrade as well, which brings the view range up and allows you to spot a lot more than some of the others. And so yeah, I just genuinely quite enjoyed this tank, and it has a bit of derpy spaced armor on the side of the vehicle. As you can see, these kind of flat plates that are angled above the tracks, above and below the tracks, and that allows you to absorb a lot of heat rounds that maybe you'd see from some of the higher tier or similar tier Soviet heavy tanks that you come up against with these things, and allows you to kind of absorb some of those rounds, maybe not take a hit every now and again, and allows you to side scrape a little bit more with this tank than maybe some of the others. But armor wise, it's probably not that good to actually side scrape at tier 5 anymore. But either way, yeah, really, really did enjoy this tank. And of course, let's move on to the final one for tier 5. And I think the next one is the T-34 Shielded. Now, this tank is essentially a T-34, like you're seeing here, that gets a turret that actually works. And by actually works, I mean that compared to the standard T-34, you can see the side armor has been extended, so it's got spaced armor, and on the side of the tank it has this spaced armor plastered all over it. And what does spaced armor do? Well, it makes the armor so much more efficient, and it also allows the turret armor to be a lot stronger, so people have to pen not only through one plate like the front of the hull, but actually the side, the other additional plate that's on top of it, making it super difficult for people to reliably pen, as well as the fact that it still has the armor of the T-34 behind it. It just has this extra additional 16mm plates all around it, so really, really nice, and makes the armor work a little bit better. As well as the fact that it does have decent penetration and damage, probably slightly less damage per minute than the standard T-34, because it has to have something worse than the tech tree version. But yeah, either way, a really, really good one. And I think it, much like the standard T-34, it is a good one too. So hopefully that's given you an indication as to the type of tanks that Tier 5 offer in terms of the mediums. Nothing outrageously broken other than the Panzer V-4, but we all know about that, and it's not really a medium tank, is it? Considering it has like double the hit points of literally all of the other mediums at the tier, and can ram all of the other mediums at the tier for full health. Yeah, either way, Tier 5 is kind of one of those weird tiers for the medium tanks, and but don't worry, because if you do not really find a Tier 5 medium that you enjoy entirely, Tier 6 offers you complete contrast. The Tier 6 mediums are unbelievably different in terms of offering you a ton of different playstyles. And this is where I think medium tanks kind of draw people in, is at tier 6. And once again, we're going to showcase some of the ones that I enjoyed playing the most, and the type of tanks that I think are the better ones, or at least offer you a little bit more enjoyment, because we can basically showcase all of the best ones, which we'll do, but yeah, the ones that also can be played to the highest level as well. So number 1 is the Cromwell B, and this is the British tier 6 premium medium tank, and it is one of the ones that I highly recommend anyone that decides to play World of Tanks to pick up at some point during their career, whether that's straight away or in a little bit. It's probably easier if you are a bit more experienced at the game to play this tank, since it relies upon being fast firing and making sure that you use the mobility of the tank. You can see here 64 kilometers an hour top speed. It has really good damage per minute. 2,500 for a medium tank at tier 6 is very good. And you can plow around into people. A 3.3 second reload to do 135 damage. Very good. And hence why I actually went ahead and 3-marked the thing. So yeah, I really did find the Cromwell B to be a superb medium tank at tier 6, and yeah, hence why we've gone ahead and played it a fair amount. And that can't be said for a lot of tier 6 mediums, as I find some of them can be a little bit boring to play. Yes, they might be good, but they're not that enjoyable, whereas this looks amazing and plays really well as well. So without further ado, let's move on. We've got the T-34-85M. Now this is also a tank that I decided to 3-mark, so that pretty much shows you the kind of tank and whether it's actually any good. But the T-34-85M is of course another premium tier 6, but you could quite easily use the T-34-85, which is the Soviet tier 6 vehicle, this one right here in fact, that you can see. So it's just basically the T-34 but like a buffed up version at tier 6. And you've also then got the T-34-88 and the T-34-85M HMH version, which is like a Heavy Metal Heroes version, and they all are pretty much quite similar. Now the T-34-85 comes in line with the T-35-85M, which is essentially like a similar sort of tank, but I think the T-34-85M has slightly more alpha damage on the Top Gun or something like that, but yeah, either way, it's still a brilliant tank at tier 6, and both of them can kind of come into one, I guess. So you have a premium and a non-premium version of the tank, but either way, really easy to do a lot of damage, have brilliant view range with all of the advanced optics that you can put on the tanks, advanced loader, you want ventilation, just to make them a little bit more useful, and of course be able to cope with some of the Hellcats that you'll be meeting at this tier as well. But the T-34-85M, really good tank, and of course the T-34. And then on kind of like the additional tank, so the number 3 in this video is the T-34-88. Now this is, I would put it with the T-34-85, but this is a tank that is better than both of those, and that's because this tank has 220 alpha damage at tier 6 that reloads very quickly. You're reloading in 5.3 seconds to do 220 damage. Now, granted, you can pretty much 3-shot all of the tier 6 vehicles in the game that are mediums or light tanks or tank destroyers, so you can very easily rip apart opponents very quickly. That can't be said for something like the HMH T-34-85M, because you have 180 damage, so you lose 40 damage and you pretty much have just slightly less reload, so you end up with less damage per minute. But remember, the T-34-88 actually is faster. It also has pretty much the same view range, so it is literally just a better version, but remember, has slightly less penetration on the standard rounds and requires you to fire. But once again, like most of the OP premiums, the limiting factor is that the standard rounds are pretty rubbish, so to make them work effectively, you have to fire premium, but because the only limitation is the standard penetration, the tank is absolutely, completely, innately broken for the most part, and this is one of the tier 6 broken tanks that I think is one of the ones Wargaming probably shouldn't sell very often, because it is not fun for the new player experience if a few super unicums decide to play in this thing. But either way, if you want something that is broken, then yeah, go ahead and buy the T3488, and it is the one that I'd highly recommend. But if you want a bit more of like a challenge, then the T3485M is a very easy challenge to play, but a little bit easier, like a little bit less broken and kind of seal clubby than the T3488. But moving swiftly onwards, we have some more tier 6s to look at in the medium section. So let's jump back to the filter, and here you have the STRV74, and we'll do a combination because I feel like it's a bit cheesy to use two of the same nation's vehicles, but it's the STRV74 and the STRV M42 Alt A2. So this is the kind of premium autoloading version of the STRV74, and I actually marked the STRV74. I don't know why I went through marking tier 6s, but at some point I must have felt like I was getting a bit bored at tier 10 or something. But either way, the STRV74 is one of these tanks that has like insane gun depression, 15 degrees. This is one of the highest gun depressions that you'll see within World of Tanks, and you can use it so well. And the main armament is so accurate and so fast at reloading, as well as dealing a decent chunk of damage, that you would just feel so confident in a lot of games, as well as having good view range, fairly mobile. It is just the all-round package, and I feel like it's very rewarding to play. You play something like a T3488, you get a 2k damage game, and you think, like, that's not that much of an achievement. You play something like the STRV74 and get 2k damage, you feel a lot more rewarded because you've had to have a bit more of an impact in terms of the amount of shells you're doing, positioning has to be better, that sort of thing. And that's why I think this tank is one of the better ones, and if a good experienced player decides to jump in this thing, I'm sure that they'd agree that this thing is a very good tank in general. But the other tank that we've kind of joined together with it is the STRV M4257, which is essentially the previous tier 5 tank that has got an autoloader, so it has like the AMX Chaffee kind of main armament, and this is a 4-shot autoloader. It deals 150 damage per shell, so you've got 600 total damage you can deal, which is amazing. It's very accurate as well for a medium tank. It has pretty poor damage per minute compared to some of the other tier 6 mediums, but at the end of the day, that's what you sacrifice for having the autoloader, and it can be really fun to just ruffle stomp around at tier 6 using this thing and just obliterating other medium tanks, and especially lower tier tanks just get removed from the game using this thing. So really fun. I've done videos on both of these, so you can have a look back on the gameplay and tank reviews playlist to have a try and find them. It should be pretty obvious because I think they're like filled with Swedish flags or something in the thumbnail, so you should be able to find it, or you can alternatively have a look on YouTube at other gameplays that might be available to you when searching the names. But either way, both of those very good tanks, and then it kind of leaves us to interpretation as to what the final vehicle and the final medium tank should be. And I guess let's jump into the other vehicles in the tech tree, because we can have a quick glance over, since we're kind of doing this on the fly. But there are a ton of medium tanks that you could choose. Now, I'm kind of reluctant to choose the M4 or the EZ8 Sherman, and I'm kind of reluctant to use the Sherman Jumbo, which is essentially like a heavy tank. I find both of them are good, but they can be a little bit boring to play, and I feel like they're not necessarily that strong in the game. And high-level skill cap players and the best players will kind of feel limited by both of these, since they're not particularly amazingly fast, and I don't know. I'm not entirely 100% sure about either of the vehicles. The Sherman Jumbo is certainly not a tank I'm interested in at all. But the EZ8 was one that I kind of enjoyed a little bit, much like the M4 Sherman at tier 5. It has a lot of flexibility with the type of gun that you want, so you could choose a wide variety of them. And in general, it's a good shout, I guess. So the kind of fifth slot is just kind of an overview as to some of the ones, because it's hard to pick a definitive kind of fifth tank, because there's a lot of mediums that can kind of take the spot. So it's good to highlight them. So I guess that's what this video is all about, and giving you the option of various different tanks that you might like. But the T21 is also a nice one, and it leads on to the T71 and the 57 heavy line, and I kind of enjoyed that tank, but don't think it's innately overpowered or anything like that. At tier 6 on the Soviet tech tree line, you kind of have the A43, which is okay, but nothing outrageous. On the German line, you do get the VKM, and now this is actually, I think, going to be the tank that we pick as the fifth slot, because this tank, the tier 6, is amazing, because it is like it's the all-round medium. It has armor, it has a gun, it has the reload, it has the speed, it has good view range to the point where like you can actually outspot a lot of light tanks and stuff, and yeah, I just found it to be very, very good. I think we went ahead and just played this through to get the Panther, but during my time it was such an easy grind to get the Panther. I thoroughly enjoyed this tank, and I highly recommend everyone to go in and try out this tank. And you know, you could always play something like the Cromwell if you're not too keen on the VKM or any of the previous, which is also a free tank as opposed to the Cromwell B. They're slightly different in terms of how they play, but they're very similar as well. So you know, either of them really good. Other than that, there's a few other tanks that you could potentially choose, but there's nothing a whole lot that I think is actually that much better than anything we've chosen. I guess you could choose the Skoda T25, but it is an autoloader that's outstanding in the game, but it's kind of difficult for new players to play, so I wouldn't necessarily call it overpowered. But this thing has a 3-shot autoloader that is unbelievably good, and so yeah, I'd highly recommend people try out the Skoda T25 as well if you do have the time. But that's kind of all of the ones. I know that we kind of went over the limit with how many tanks we had, but it's difficult in choosing just 5, and it's also sometimes difficult to choose a definitive option with regards to which is the best of the final, because you usually have some standout performers, and then that intermediate range is where it kind of becomes difficult. So hopefully we've highlighted all of the tanks that I kind of enjoy myself. And of course, if you think that there's anything I've missed or any tank that you think absolutely not, that tank is awful, let me know in the comment section down below, and tell everyone else about the tanks that you might think are the best mediums at tiers 5 and 6. And hopefully you did enjoy this video. Don't forget to stick around and subscribe to catch out tiers 7 and tiers 8, and then we'll look at tiers 9 and tiers 10, and then at the end we'll do an entire video combining all of the previous videos into one, and hopefully you guys enjoy it. So if you're watching that video, then yeah, you've already seen it. But other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.